All right. Welcome to the LGS show. I'm your host, Liam Sellers. Thanks for tuning in. Got a lot to cover today. Going to preview the vice presidential debate between Mike Pence and Kamala Harris. The president is a little under the weather.
He's got AIDS.
And I want to talk to you about a tale of two states. But as we discuss all these topics today, and I will go into further detail, I want you to keep in mind the idea of narratives and how they have such a dangerous influence on our political discourse. What is the definition of a narrative? In short, a narrative is a representation or a description of a particular situation that reflects a certain set of goals or ideals. So we're constantly pursuing confirmation bias as opposed to truth. And I think it's pretty evident that we see this in every aspect of our political discourse. On social media, we follow people that tend to believe in the same principles that we do. We get our news from those same sources. I just want you to keep that in mind because so much of what you see is a misrepresentation of truth. And it's just an advancement of narrative. And I want you to understand just how that affects the public's ability to accurately receive information. Now I get to tonight's vice presidential debate between Mike Pence and Kamala Harris, the only debate that these two are going to have. But before we get into the actual debate and the substance that's going to be covered, I just want to express my absolute disbelief that there's going to be plexiglass, the shit you've been seeing in restaurants, grocery stores, everywhere in public. The plexiglass is going to be divided amongst the two candidates as if they're not 6 feet apart, as if they're not tested, as if the venue is not adhering to social distancing protocols. The science isn't there. The evidence isn't there. So why is the Harris campaign requesting this? Plain and simple, it's about a narrative. They want to create the narrative that coronavirus is in every aspect of our lives. And you could see that because this plexiglass is going to serve as a subtle reminder of that. That's the only reason why this is there. It's absolutely stupid. The Pence campaign should have fought back harder on this, but it is what it is. This lady thinks she's walking into fucking Chernobyl. It's just embarrassing. It is completely pointless, and it's virtue signaling. It's a distraction from the issues at hand, and she's hoping that that's going to be the one big takeaway from this vice presidential debate. Let's just hope that Pence comes at her with substance and that ultimately the substance outweighs the optics. I'll give credit where credit is due. Harris is accomplished. She's well-read. And she knows how to climb up the power ladder. That's about it. That's all I'm going to give her. And the reason why I'm saying this is because you're hearing a lot of speculation that she's going to absolutely destroy Pence tonight because she's such a fierce prosecutor and all that BS. Let's just give you a little history lesson here as to her debate performances.
She put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations and then laughed about it when she was asked if she ever smoked marijuana. She blocked evidence. That would have freed an innocent man from death row until the courts forced her to do so. She kept people in prison beyond their sentences to use them as cheap labor for the state of California. And she fought to keep cash bail system in place that impacts poor people in the worst kind of way.
Thank you.
Pretty self-evident, right? I mean, Tulsi Gabbard pretty much ended her campaign that night. I want to quickly fast forward to a month from now. One of the excuses or talking points, and there's going to be plenty, should the Biden-Harris ticket lose in November, is that America just couldn't accept the reality of having a woman of color being a heartbeat away from the presidency. Mark my words, it's going to happen. You heard it here first. Watch. Even now, they're suggesting that any criticism of her record is a direct result of racism and sexism as opposed to the fact that her record is incredibly flawed and extremely radical. They don't want to address the holes in her record, the fact that her record is abysmal. But it's just easier to resort to ad hominem attacks. They're calling you a racist, they're calling us sexist, they're calling us outdated, they're calling us prejudiced. It's easier. And that's going to be their talking point. And it's like a double whammy. Boom, boom, boom. Racist, boom. Sexist, boom. They're just going to hit you from all angles. Okay, you want to create that standard? By all means, have at it. I just have one simple question. Is the overwhelming majority of the Democrat base racist, sexist, bigoted? I mean, they overwhelmingly rejected her campaign. It wasn't even close. She polled at 1%. She didn't even make it to Iowa. She suspended her campaign before Christmas. Are they racist and sexist? No, of course not. That would be absurd to suggest something like that. Rather, they rejected her campaign because she's a fraud. She's a phony. She's a character assassin. She takes the positions that are politically convenient. She's a flip-flopper. She's for prison reform, but yet if you look at her record as a prosecutor, it tells the exact opposite. One day she believes Tara Reade, and now she doesn't. She called Joe Biden a bigoted racist, and now she's hopping on his campaign ticket. That's why the Democrat base overwhelmingly rejected her. It's that simple. Not because of her sex, not because of her race. It was because her record was a disaster, plain and simple. And any suggestion that it's about race or sex is used as a cop-out argument to shield her and alleviate her from the responsibility of thoroughly addressing her record. That's why she was rejected in the primary, and I hope that she's overwhelmingly rejected in November as well. The purpose for why I'm spending a large portion of this first segment emphasizing Harris is because she's going to be the actual president should Biden win in November. She's going to be responsible for implementing his administration's agenda. Biden's a figurehead. It's that simple. The dude barely has enough energy to campaign, let alone govern. Last month, he called lids on nearly 50% of the days in September, or every other day. He gets up, gives a little speech. By 9 a.m., 10 a.m., he's done. Back to the basement. Does anyone genuinely believe that he has the stamina to take that emergency phone call at 3 in the morning? Or that he has the endurance to preside over this nation for 4 years and deal with all of our issues? Of course not. No rational person would believe that. And what you saw in September is a small glimpse of what his presidency will look like. Hence, he's going to delegate a lot of responsibility and authority to Harris and his other subordinates. That is why it is critical for Pence tonight to bring awareness to her record and her character. In many ways, this is a Harris-Biden ticket. So to wrap that up, you're going to see how a narrative is going to be established that Harris is a fierce debater, that she's an immaculate candidate, that she's a fighter for certain values, when you know that she was obliterated on the debate stage. She's not an immaculate candidate. Her record is spotty, and that she flip-flops on everything. All I say is do the research yourself, assess the candidate with your own eyes, and don't be subjected to a media narrative about her. In other news, the president tested positive for COVID-19. He was admitted to Walter Reed over the weekend, and he's been battling the illness since Friday. Let's hope he recovers fully and quickly, and I'm glad that Biden, his wife, Pence, they all tested negative. We don't want to wish illness on our elected leaders. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because the news media was quick to blame the Rose Garden ceremony in which the president announced his Supreme Court nomination. They're quick to blame that ceremony itself for being a super spreader of the coronavirus outbreak in which the president contracted the virus, despite the fact that there's no scientific evidence or data that suggests that theory, let alone validate it. That's because it's physically impossible to determine where and when exactly the president came in contact with the virus and thus contracted it. But you see, that doesn't matter to the media. It's about creating a narrative, not seeking truth. The funny thing about the media is that they deliberately go out of their way to convince you that a small outdoor gathering at the White House or a small wedding can be linked to coronavirus outbreaks within those communities, yet hundreds of thousands of people standing shoulder to shoulder in the streets, rioting, protesting, has no direct link to coronavirus outbreaks within those communities. That alone should tell you everything you need to know about the bullshit media narrative surrounding this pandemic. But they were wearing masks, we're told. Okay, by the way, there were plenty of people that weren't wearing masks, and I actually support these protests. I don't think a virus should prohibit you from exercising your First Amendment rights. But that's neither here nor there. Let's assume that they were wearing masks for the sake of the argument. By that definition, if 50,000 people wearing masks can congregate on Santa Monica Boulevard and protest, then I can go to a baseball game. I can go to Coachella. Or better yet, I can open up my small business that's been closed for the past 6 months. We need to be rational here. The science is inconsistent at best regarding mask wearing. But hey, public health officials want to err on the side of caution, and I'm for that. In a pandemic, I think that's completely justified. But they've all concluded that mask wearing reduces, not prevents, your chances from contracting the COVID-19 virus. So let's stop excusing that behavior that we witnessed throughout the summer as acceptable because they were wearing masks. That's a dishonest talking point. But listen to Fauci, we're told. Okay, well, what about Fauci when he said that crowds are bad? Or that there's absolutely no reason why we can't vote in person in November? Or that he opposes entering more economic lockdowns moving forward. Fuck him. But it's whatever. Oh, okay. Or you could be a rational person, take other scientists, and by the way, there are thousands that have differing outlooks regarding this pandemic, this COVID-19 virus. Take all other factors into consideration and not just hold Fauci on a pedestal and have him be the end-all be-all with this thing and take his word as gospel. Well, we're the party that believes in science. We listen to the scientists. Oh, okay. Well, how about the science that tells us that there are only two genders? Want to talk to me about that? Or the science that indicates that schools are not vectors for transmitting this virus, and if that you were to practice social distancing within them, that they are completely safe to reopen. It's been practiced in Europe. It's been practiced in Florida. How about that? Or how about the science behind the negative psychological impacts of these devastating economic lockdowns? Want to talk to me about that? You see, for leftists, science is political, it's malleable, it's subjective, it's used as a tool to confirm our biases. What we believe ought to be true and not what is actually true. This completely contradicts the entire premise of the scientific method itself, where you formulate a hypothesis, you test it with experimental data, and you come to a conclusion that is concrete. Science is concrete. Notice how most of the left says, most scientists believe, the majority of scientists say, blah, blah, blah. It's never it is or it isn't. For example, gravity is the central force of this earth. It's not most scientists believe that gravity, no, it just is. They use that same standard in the medieval ages with the Catholic Church when they used to say, well, most of the church believes that the earth was the center of our galaxy, of our solar system. It took Galileo and a few other astronomers to disprove that and rightfully determine that the sun was actually the center of our galaxy. What happened to him, if you study history, he was a heretic. He was excommunicated from the church. He was labeled insane. You see that behavior being replicated today with anyone that challenges the left scientific theories, which is the fundamental premise of science. It's to challenge, exchange differing viewpoints, not to ostracize those that challenge your narrative. That sounds like a cult to me, not science. My last segment regarding media narratives, a tale of two states. Take this. What if I were to propose to you that there are two states in this country with roughly similar population sizes? They both had knowledge of this novel coronavirus around the same time, and that they both had governors in charge of overseeing the management of this pandemic within their respective states. And given that information, what if I were to tell you that one state witnessed 33,000 deaths and another state witnessed 15,000 deaths? Listen, a death is a death, and it's totally tragic, and I'm not here to downplay that. But for the sake of the argument, let's analyze the numbers. I have one question for you. Who would you give praise towards, if you even could, and who would you criticize more? After 1 second of contemplating that question, I hope your answer would be, no shit, I would praise the governor that had less deaths and criticize the one that had more. And you'd be right in a rational world, but unfortunately, we don't live in a rational world. Now, what you see is the complete inverse. And what am I talking about? New York and Florida. Now, let's quickly assess the coronavirus information within these two respective states. So New York has a population of about 19 million people. Florida has a population of about 21 million people. Yet New York witnessed about twice as many deaths than Florida, 33,000 in comparison to 15,000. Despite the fact that Florida has a larger population, an older population, many seniors retire down there, and that Florida was the #1 landing spot of infected New Yorkers in early March once the outbreak had initially occurred in the United States. Oh, Sellers, what about New York's population density? That has no comparison to any city in Florida whatsoever. Oh, okay. Fine, I'll take that into consideration. If you were to take out the entire area of New York City and classify that as its own state, New York State has approximately 11,000 deaths in comparison to Florida that has 15,000 deaths. Yet, we're talking about population density here. If you were to hypothetically do that, New York would have a way lower population density, and it only has 4,000 less deaths by that standard. And by the way, Florida has 4 metropolitan areas that exceed 1 million people: Miami, Jacksonville, Orlando, and Tampa Bay. So spare me the talking point of population density. I think it's pretty irrelevant to this conversation. The biggest reason why you see such a discrepancy between the overall death rate and number of deaths between these two states comes down to leadership. you have Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, and you have Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York. The simple fact is Cuomo is incompetent. And the biggest mistake he made was ordering nursing homes, mandating them to accept COVID-infected patients within their facilities, despite the fact that the science indicated that that would be a total disaster, and as a result, about a third of the deaths in New York State are a direct consequence of that. That's not a political talking point, or like you're going to hear the excuse that it's a right-wing talking point. No, that's just a simple admission of fact. Now that you've been provided a summary of the COVID information regarding these two states, you would rationally conclude that DeSantis of Florida would be receiving all the praise and Cuomo would be receiving all the criticism, yet the opposite has transpired. The last 6 months, you've been seeing nonstop praise and acclaim from the media towards Cuomo about his leadership, his action, his empathy, his speeches, and now he's got a book deal that just came out of nowhere that's going to detail his account of what happened behind the scenes as he was overseeing this disaster that occurred in his state. He's getting a book deal. Why? Because he gives dumbed down speeches with colorful diagrams in the background? I mean, that's basically what I do. Where the fuck is my book deal? You have, on the other hand, DeSantis being accused of murder, having blood on his hands, that he's an idiot, that he's gambling with people's lives. And the evidence, the data suggests the complete opposite. And the fact is, it's all about narratives and has nothing to do with facts. The starking contrast of media narratives surrounded by these two governors could not be more apparent than through the lens of Chris Cuomo, the dipshit CNN anchor at 9 p.m. I mean, the guy's a fraud. The guy's an idiot. He is the poster boy for nepotism. And the only reason why he has that job is because his brother was a governor and so was his dad. And this guy just loves to play the victim card. I'm sorry. I don't know if you saw, he went on Bill Maher and was basically trying to give a justified explanation as to why him being called Fredo Cuomo is the equivalent of being called the N-word.
And Fredo, I'm sorry, it's just not a thing. It's just not a slur.
Well, I'll tell you what's interesting about, I guess this is social progress, that you can now have an opinion about what an Italian can find offensive, you know.
And listen, Chris, I understand you're not a bright guy to begin with, but let me just clue you in on this little dilemma you have here. When comparing Fredo, or the N-word, and trying to determine what is more offensive, when one word cannot be said in its entirety, I think you have the answer to that question. Fredo and the N-word are not even in the same ballpark. Now, why are you witnessing such a media onslaught towards Ron DeSantis? In part, it's because he's the governor of a crucial swing state. I think the media has calculated that these attacks can sway the election towards Biden's favor, at least in Florida. That's part of it. But the main reason is he decided to go against the scientific narrative. He decided to go against the grain and adhere to other scientists' perspectives who don't necessarily agree that economic and infinite lockdowns are the solution to mitigating the spread of the virus. He's decided to keep his economy open, and as a result, his economic outlook is far more promising than New York's, and he's decided to challenge that, and he's willing to stick with it and see it through, and so far it's paying off. And the media cannot stand that because he's challenging the overarching narrative that lockdowns are the only way to move forward with this, and that no other alternatives are even worth consideration. In short, if Andrew Cuomo had an R next to his name and Ron DeSantis had a D next to his name, you'd be hearing a much different tune from our news media. That wraps up today's episode. I hope that I was able to successfully illustrate to you how media narratives distort truth and reality. And at the very least, if you decide after this episode to just do your own research, access other reputable and credible sources, and not swallow everything you're spoon-fed by news corporations, then my purpose here has been fulfilled. I want to thank you for sticking this one out with me today. I'm Liam Sellers. See you next time.